Hello there everyone! We've gone over all 12 factions that are going to be introduced in Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2, but we're not quite done with that just yet, for there's still a lot of additional stuff that I haven't even been aware of partway through of going through these videos, talking about all the additions that were going to be made to the old factions, as well as what we're going to be seeing with the Craft World Eldar, Dark Eldar, as well as the Necrons and Tyranids, mind you. No, there's still a lot more to talk about there, at least enough for one more final video, if nothing else. For Games Workshop has decided to put like a compendium there to update the rules in 2010. A lot of it is just a lot of clarification and rewording on a lot of the basic rules, but there are also enhancements to like certain factions that may have been underperforming, or at least adds a lot more diversity to them. And you've seen a little bit there with talking about the Tau Protector fleet there with the Custodian Protector and Sauce, because that was also in the Compendium there that I found, so that's just a brief example of what the Compendium has to offer. But nonetheless, I am probably just going to skim over the majority of the basic rules there, aside for a couple of key things that I noticed, although it would take forever to dissect and distinguish what's new and what's enhanced there that could affect Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 as far as like new additions, new rules and mechanics. But there are a few things to note there, especially when you consider, I feel like personally, that there's going to be inclusion of like, ship squadrons there, and ship squadrons has been a pretty important factor to the tabletop game in general, mainly because it allows you to do those command checks, those leadership checks for an entire squad as opposed to doing them individually, because the main consequence of doing it individually is if you ever fail a leadership role, all the ships that you have yet to do orders for, like your lock on, your reload, your all ahead full, they would not be allowed to take their turn there. So once you failed, that was it. So with the squadrons in place there for your frigates especially, you are able to minimize the amount of rolling you had to do, especially when you consider you also get rerolls for your admiral ship there, as well as like a couple of special traits that allows you to get rerolls for each of those squadrons in case they were to fail every now and then. It is of course a far cry to what we have in Armada 1 currently, because the closest thing we have to that is just straight up the insubordination chance there, whereas they didn't have the mechanics for ships rebelling aside for like the Demiurge mercenary trait we talked about when we were talking about Tau, mind you. There was nothing quite like that there. But one of the big examples of squadrons in general, aside for like the leadership role I talked about, is that they also were able to protect each other relatively easily too. For the normal firing rules was you could only shoot at the target that was closest to you, unless you made like a leadership roll to shoot at something further away. And even then, you were kind of forced to shoot at the closest ship in the squadron, so this would only take effect if you were shooting at a different squadron altogether, mind you. So it made it a lot more easier to split the damage, especially if you were playing a super aggressive type of fleet like the Imperial Navy or Orcs, mind you. Have them in a squadron group together, and all three of your ships, if you position them properly and effectively, would be spraying out the damage while dishing it out hopefully just as well, especially when you consider they have two broadside weaponry that potentially hit multiple targets at once. And while this hasn't technically been confirmed that there would be squadrons in the game, it seemed likely if you had watched some of my previous videos there talking about like the news regarding Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2, I made an observation that there was like 2 Necron squadrons potentially for their event back in France over in February. There was like some screenshots that include the Phalanx and another shot that showed the Necrons versus Mechanicus, and it seemed like there were squadrons of cruisers of sorts at least. So it will be interesting to see what dynamics it includes, assuming squadrons are in play for Armada 2. Also in this compendium, they included rules for like the Ordnance fighters that is something that's already in play with Armada 1, that's the Combat Air Patrol. Before, in the base rule set, you had your fighters and bombers independently controlled there. You had them fly around and intercept torpedoes, intercept bombers, as well as doing their own bombing runs on the opposing capital ships there. But with the Combat Air Patrol that was included there, you are allowed to kind of have them follow a cruiser, kind of exactly how it works in Armada 1 now. As soon as you were to get attacked by bombers or torpedoes, these fighters would kind of intercept them immediately there and shoot down what is at least possible for them there. Normally it's like one fighter would destroy an entire torpedo salvo on its own there, and fighters and bombers would basically nullify each other out, with the exception if there was undefended bomber squadrons, in which case the fighter would be able to take out multiples at a time, I would believe. But this rule set is based, like I said already, exactly as it is introduced in Armada 1. We don't have the convenience of being able to control the fighters independently, which would make scouting potentials a lot more useful if that was in the game there, but this is what we got here, and it may be enhanced even further potentially in Armada 2 if Tindalos feel like the extra control and micromanagement is warranted, because otherwise this keeps the bombers and fighters quite simple and easy to understand, where having them independently controlled is going to be a nightmare for unskilled, unprepared type of players, without a doubt. It does nonetheless add a new dynamic that really intrigues me if it were to ever make it into the game, to independently control the fighters and bombers. But now let's talk about the specific changes that were included for each of the factions there, at least that are of note. And for the Imperial Navy, and of course the Adeptus Mechanicus primarily, there is a note here, at least for the Endeavor, Endurance, and Defiance, which are the ships that I demonstrated to you or shown to you way back with the Imperial Navy and Mechanicus fleets there, that I made a note about how they only had 5+ armor or 50 armor on the prow there. In the case of the Compendium, there is a rule specifically for those new light cruisers at least that allows them to upgrade their prow to 6+ armor, but it does reduce their mobility, so I'm going to assume this is the rule that encouraged the Dauntlesses to also have that additional prow armor there in Armada 1. But it's hard to really say after the fact if their mobility was decreased as opposed to what the Dauntlesses would be otherwise, because we are talking about like turn-based combat and a 90-degree turn as opposed to 45, because technically the Dauntlesses are still slightly more maneuverable than their cruiser counterparts, but it's hard to really say for certain. There are also, of course, a lot of other rules there, but most of them are about point adjustments and possible upgrades to specific ships there, which we kind of talked about before in the Imperial Navy, where how a handful of them were able to swap out their Nova cannons for torpedoes and vice versa. But one thing a lot of these rules do talk about a lot is the concept of allies and reserve fleets there, especially with like factions that are allied with each other, like of course the Space Marines, Adeptus Mechanicus, and Imperial Navy, or how you're allowed to incorporate other elements of their fleets into your own. But there were restrictions and limitations there, kind of at like a vague example of how the mercenary system works there for the Tau Empire, only instead of running away when crippled there, you just didn't get like the benefits of rerolls, I believe, for most of these cases, unless it's stated otherwise, I do believe. So there were other restrictions placed upon them instead. And why I feel this is significant, because for the Chaos Fleet there's notes of renegade Imperial vessels that you can kind of incorporate into your Chaos Fleet to kind of like serve those niche roles. And of course the big obvious one is the Widowmaker, for you are allowed to take a cruiser and a handful of frigates there for a certain amount of points. And of course, if you played Armada 1, you know the value of the extended sensor range that a Widowmaker could provide. Of course, if these were also introduced in like multiplayer or just skirmish games entirely, that would be opening up a can of worms as far as balance concerns. It would be almost a nightmare to kind of balance it and manage it properly, because there's allied rules for almost every other faction if you so wish. So realistically, we're probably not going to see this in Armada 2 aside for very specific niche cases, which I will talk about later. But for now, let's have a look at the Eldar, it's more specifically the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, for there's an update to the rules there that's pretty damn significant, in that the Dark Eldar cruisers are allowed to include 2 Impaler modules, where if you saw the video where I was talking about the Eldar fleets before, it implied you were only able to include a single Impaler module. But in this case, you're allowed to have 2 of them, and what these are, to remind everyone, is that these are very effective boarding crafts that do hit and run attacks. They also were capable of doing permanent damage to the ship, so they were very effective in that regard. Not to mention really difficult to destroy, but incredibly short-ranged. So this opens up a possibility of very aggressive boarding plays by the Drukhari, but it remains to be seen until more information is out. Now alas, there wasn't really much other specific quick notes and changes to all the other factions, but there were mentions of the Necron fleet about a nightmare field that I had a really hard time finding rules about, and that's mainly because they were referring to the Necron tomb ship weapon, the Sepulchre, although they never did word it in a way that it mentioned as a nightmare field, the attack, mind you, but that was the only thing of note that stood out for me for Necrons and the other factions at least. But like I said, there's still a lot of new stuff to get excited about, and apparently they included a whole bunch of new ships for the Imperial Navy as well as Chaos there, and of course by osmosis the Adeptus Mechanicus and Space Marines as well, I would imagine. For we have the Victory class battleship here, and if you remember what I showed you of the Apocalypse class battleship, this is kind of the same thing. The only big difference is the Apocalypse class battleship had much more powerful lances. Even though they were shorter range, they were able to hit harder, and you were able to alleviate the short range with activating your lock-on special order. There were other caveats and catches as well, especially the slower speed, so the Vanquisher could serve as a little more balanced in that regard, at least not as punishing, but I think I like the potential of the Apocalypse a lot more. It just depends on how it's implemented, provided of course it makes into Armada 2. We also have the Vanquisher class battleship, which for all intents and purposes is no different than what the Lunar class cruiser would be like, in that it's like a hybrid ship. It has a couple of lances, it has the macro broadside weaponry as well as no dorsal turrets on it there, which is kind of a unique trait of the battleships we've seen so far that's of the Imperial Navy. Hell, it even has less torpedoes in comparison to the other battleships, which I believe was strength 9 for like the Retribution and other equivalent type of battleships, but in the case of this, it's strength 6, which is the exact same as the regular cruisers, so in all seriousness, I don't know what to make of this battleship. But we do have another substitute for the Mars class battlecruiser, if Novacans were not just saying for whatever reason, for we have the Dominion class battlecruiser, which trades out to Novacan for torpedoes, and it has a bunch of lances on the broadside to complement the fighters and the dorsal turrets it has on top. So mind you, the broadside lances are only 9,000 range in their current setup, so they could get extended kind of like how the Overlord did in Armada 1, but it's a different variety nonetheless, if your priority at least was the fighter capabilities to defend against torpedoes and heavy bomber fleets. But here's a battle cruiser that I'm personally excited to see in Armada 2. It's the Mercury class battle cruiser. It has a handful of upgrades available to it, but what makes it unique, of course, it's like basically a Dominator. It's an upgrade supercharged Dominator. It has even enhanced speed on top of it to make matters worse. This thing is going to be going 188 speed, and it has special rules for it, but its broadside weaponry is kind of equivalent to what you would expect of a Tyrant maybe, as in 12,000 range long range macro cannons, as well as the shorter range ones that potentially hit a little bit harder, which is kind of weird. We're seeing the reverse role here for whatever reason. Normally it's the shorter range that hit harder, so I can't explain this weird predicament unless it's a weird typo, but nonetheless, it's what you would expect in a battlecruiser version of a Dominator if I had to go fathom a guess. But it does have upgrades like I mentioned earlier there that allow it to enhance the weaker macro cannons to at least be equivalent to the 12,000 range of the other version, but the one main trait is that it's almost guaranteed to suffer a void explosion as noted in the rules, where when the ship's destroyed, you roll 2 dice to determine what actually happens to the ship, and more often than not, it's going to just become a floating debris wreck, is mainly what happens to it as far as the tabletop version. Then it's just going to continue drifting along the course it was going, and then you just roll again in preceding turns. But in the case of the Mercury, it has a greater chance you roll an extra dice to get those kind of explosions, which is why I'm assuming this thing, if it makes it into Armada 2, will basically have a guaranteed void explosion. Kind of like how the Orc upgrade kind of guarantees that same result. And it's also part of the reason why it has the enhanced engines. It's a lot more volatile as a result of that. And interestingly enough, we have a brand new type of light cruiser to also include into the Imperial Navy, although we don't actually have a visual what this dang ship is for whatever weird reason, but straight up, this thing is just a gunboat, a big, massive gunboat in comparison to a frigate-like type of equivalent like the Sword and the Gladius. This thing is going to be doing lots of macro damage there, and hell, it could even justify the Imperial Navy having like a big, meaty, lots of weight behind it type of macro cannons as opposed to the more rapid-fire version that we have in the Dauntless. It would justify it, aside of course its 2 turrets that it has on top. It'll be an interesting dynamic to see without a doubt. It remains to be seen if this ship makes it in there, how it's going to function because of those slight differences with rate of fire as opposed to fighting in a turn-based sense. And hell, even their Havoc class frigate for all intents and purposes is a more potent type of gunboat. Mind you, it trades off a little bit of its turret firepower for like prow weaponry, but it is technically more guns if you want to go that route. If you want to kind of unleash your orcish ambitions into your Imperial Navy fleet. But the one frigate I'm really interested in is this Viper class destroyer. For they trade off the macro turret on top of the ship for just really extra torpedoes, and it'll remain to be seen if this makes it into the game how that's going to play out. For we haven't really seen anything that shoots like uneven a number of torpedoes, so this could get upgraded to fire 4 torpedoes, which would technically make it have the same kind of burst potential as like a Dauntless torpedo variant, which would be amusing and definitely be interesting, especially with the short burn torpedo upgrade. This thing would be doing a notable amount of burst damage at a relatively safe distance too. So there is a lot of possibility for the ship despite how fragile it probably is going to be. But we're done with the Imperial Navy for now. Let's have a look at something to really excite you for possible DLC for Armada 2. For this is a faction that isn't even going to make it into Armada 2 at release, and we're going to be talking about the Inquisition. We have rules specifically for them, and they changed dynamic a little bit for your Imperial Navy style fleets, or even your Space Marine kind of fleet if you want to go with the Grey Knight type of variant playstyle. For how the Inquisition works in a nutshell there for Battlefleet Gothic is that your Lord can be of one of 3 different types of the Inquisition there. You can be of the Ordo Hereticus, the Ordo Xenos, or the Ordo Malleus, and all of these would give you different bonuses for your fleet. Or at the very least, the ships that were qualified to utilize the crew of the Inquisition. Normally it was just the Lord's personal flagship, the Admiral's ship as it were, but you can also enhance them for like your other ships. They were kind of baseline for at least the Grey Knight type of ships. But it's not just Grey Knight ships that they're bringing, they are including their own type of cruiser, which is the Inquisitorial Cruiser. I am really hoping I'm saying that right, it took me a few tries, but these things are going to be quite interesting. They're technically battle cruisers for all intents and purposes, but they have the shields, they have the health for it, they have the 6 armor all around, so these things are going to be putting strike cruisers to shame in more ways than one, because they also have the Thunderhawks and they also have bombardment cannons on the damn thing. And from the looks of it, they have 2 bombardment cannons if you were to gauge the strength that the strike cruiser variant had. These things are still pretty damn potent, and if these ships were to ever make it a Space Marine fleet in any form, that would be a massive power enhancement for the Space Marines. Oh, but that doesn't mean the Grey Knight Strike Cruiser is any less of a joke, mind you, for a lot of the upgrade options on the Grey Knights have been included with the regular Space Marines of the Compendium as well. And those type of upgrades I'm talking about, of course, is the means to change out your Thunderhawk launch bays on the prow and replace them with torpedoes, lances, or in the case here that did not make it to Armada 1, a Strength 5 bombardment cannon. You can get 2 bombardment cannons on a strike cruiser, and the prow one would be even more powerful than the turret that you already have. Technically only the Vanguard in Armada 1 has a prow type of bombardment cannon, but even then it is a far cry to what the strike cruisers have, and even the battle barge. So it's a bit surprising this upgrade did not make it into Armada 1, but I guess with the possibility of guaranteed critical hits with upgrades and of course the Chapter Master favor, there may have been very genuine concerns for the bombardment cannon, but with how fragile the strike cruisers can be, considering the sheer amount of armor-piercing weaponry, most of which, remember, the torpedoes and the bombers didn't really penetrate armor. It was really just the lances and the bombardment cannon that had a reliable means to penetrate through the armor, so they were lacking a little bit of power that may have been necessary to make up for how much more fragile they were in Armada 1. Especially when you consider that the Grey Knight strike cruisers also have 2 points of shields on them, whereas the regular Space Marine strike cruisers only had a single point to them. So that's also another factor that kind of made them a little more fragile. But we can't finish off talking about the Inquisition without talking about its unique type of battleship, the Inquisition Black Ship. And technically, this isn't really a combat ship for all intents and purposes. This is more of a prison ship, where they harbor mainly the Psychers as described by the Jeller field. But this is the Inquisitor's personal type of flagship for his role, for his job as it were. For fielding this ship here isn't necessarily a positive for you in the traditional battle terms there, for you're paying almost the same amount of points for a battleship in general, but this thing has less firepower and less lances on top of it, never mind the less torpedoes that I already mentioned before with the Vanquisher class ship. In truth though, this thing just serves as a secondary objective for your opponent, for if the ship was ever destroyed or ever suffered a critical hit to the Jeller field, which was connected to the shield generator mind you, so if you ever lost your shields this would also get damaged, then it would give your opponent that much more victory points for determining the winner. But interestingly enough, if this is for the purposes of the campaign where you're seeing the renown, then you actually get bonus renown if it survives, which would be kind of like a high risk, high reward type of fleet setup, if I were to argue. But for individual battles, this would be very impractical unless it had very specific abilities and traits to it for Armada 2. It would, in all honesty, be more of something for the campaign, if it ever makes an introduction at all. And while I may have made no mention of a Grey Knight battle barge, there is, for all intents and purposes, no different than a regular Space Marine battle barge. It's just the additional rules of the Grey Knights being so much more effective than in comparison to regular Space Marines that it costs a little bit more as a result of that. And what exactly those rules are is the fact that they are specialized for fighting against demons and of course forces of chaos, so there is wording here that every single Grey Knight ship is able to negate pretty much any leadership or effects that are imbued upon it by chaos marks. So arguably the Mark of Slaanesh that can lock down all your orders and abilities for a certain duration would not work against a Grey Knight vessel, and also Marks of Khorne that enhance their boarding potential would not work either, as some basic examples. Whereas the other Inquisitional Lord types I mentioned before only enhance maybe the flagship. It doesn't really state anything about enhancing the other ships as well, aside for the fact that you can get additional upgrades on the ship for your Ordo Xenos Lord. That is the last all there is to talk about the Inquisition there. A lot of it was lore and fluff-based type stuff there, but let's have a look at the Space Marines for it. There's some interesting stuff to get excited about. Hell, I already mentioned the upgrade possibility of the Proud bombardment cannons, and there's also additional stuff to get excited about too. For one, you have the option of basically making an Imperial Navy type of battleship or battle cruiser part of a venerable battle barge, as it were. So you're basically enhancing the current stock variant of a Mars or Retribution and enhancing it to be equipped with Space Marine crew as well as other additional upgrades to it, which primarily would be boarding torpedoes as well as being able to switch it out with regular torpedoes if it was already equipped with a Nova cannon on it for whatever reason. It of course would not have the armor that most Space Marine ships have there, but it would probably serve as a nice little niche there for filling out a role, especially for a battle cruiser mind you, although these things for all intents and purposes are kind of the equivalent, treated as a battleship for all intents and purposes, so it would have to be changed a tiny bit there. But having a function like an additional battleship or even a battle cruiser would be pretty nice. It does alas only get to have strike cruisers as opposed to regular bombers, mind you, but the Space Marines did have access to the Thunderhawk Annihilators, which you may have seen worried on in the Grey Knight upgrade options, mind you, which are basically the variant of the Thunderhawks that can just bomb the target as opposed to boarding them, which is an upgrade that's already in Armada 1. And hell, they give us a very specific example, a very unique example of a battle barge that you can also field for Space Marines, and to be honest, this almost feels like a bit of a joke ship, cause the simple question is, what's better than 3 bombardment cannons? Well, the answer to that is 9 bombardment cannons apparently, for this thing has swapped out all of its macro cannons for even more bombardment cannons. Mind you, they're stuck to the left and right of the ship there, the broadside, but this is still the same amount of power, just amplified tremendously. I do seriously believe this is a little bit of a joke, just to a vague extent, because this seems like overkill. It is vicious without a doubt if this were somehow to make it into Armada 2, but for all intents and purposes, this is a very unique type of ship there, and not like a general rule. Now the strike cruisers, I already mentioned them a good amount with the Grey Knights, but here is again there with the option of replacing the dorsal bombardment can with a lance, if it suits your function, what you're going for with a Space Marine fleet. But the important thing I made mention of with the Grey Knights is the increased shields, and the strike cruisers of all the other Space Marine fleets also had that option there if you were willing to invest the points into it, so that would probably be a much needed change that maybe that would get baseline for all the strike cruisers, possibly. And while the Space Marine updates are short and sweet, they're still exciting nonetheless. But the Adeptus Mechanicus, they have their own section as well for changes and additions, but for the life of me, I could not find anything specific, definitely not like brand new ships or rules, mind you, so I would imagine a lot of this is just clarifying a lot of the rules for the ships. Especially like the one mechanic where they're kind of forced to shoot at their own independent wrecks of their ships, or hulks as they're called, where it was clarified a little bit that they're only supposed to prioritize shooting their own ships and don't suffer the negative effects of having to shoot down Imperial Navy ships should they get destroyed. But you know what is exciting though? Although technically it's not as exciting as the Inquisition might be as getting introduced in Armada 2 at some point, but the Rogue Traders are also another kind of sub-faction you can include into your Battlefleet Gothic games, and primarily this was like the main candidate that allows you to have like a diverse type of fleet there. You just kind of suffer the lack of a battleship for all intents and purposes, outside of like a Demiurge, a stronghold, which you do have the rules and the means to field one of them with a Rogue Trader type of fleet. And for those of you not aware of the lore of the Rogue Traders, it's as straightforward as it sounds. These are like the training fleets of the fringe worlds, the edge of the Imperium, for all intents and purposes, where they're kind of forced to kind of cooperate with a lot of the Xenos factions there. Most of them become pirates and all sorts, but these are the ships there, and they have their own slight little tweaks as well. Like the cruiser ships have the option of including a specific upgrade to them. Before fielding into a battle, they just get the upgrade straight away. I can't quite remember if you roll for it or if it's one that you choose that further enhances the effectiveness of your cruisers, mind you. And while in truth there's only like a single cruiser the Rogue Traders have available to them, they don't even have a light cruiser. They only have this one Rogue Trader cruiser and a handful of frigates, mostly just haulers and like retrofitted type of transport ships for all intents and purposes. But with the addition of like Xenos vessels and, like I said, being able to incorporate alien frigates and other ships to their cause, including crew war spears and, like I already hinted, the Demiurge, they can provide like a very diverse and different kind of theme to your at least Imperium style type of fleet. And if for whatever reason you didn't want to go with Xenos ships, you can include like strike cruisers and even the Imperial Navy type of ships to kind of complement them as well. So you had very diverse options available to you as the Rogue Traders. Hell, they even introduced 3 different types of races, alien races that the Rogue Traders can have as part of their fleets there. For all intents and purposes though, they're all frigates, mind you, and even their stats are the exact same, so there's nothing really exciting to show there. They only have like slightly different rules to them. But their layout is the exact same. They have like 2 strength to their weapon batteries, and they have 1 strength to their lances, and all 3 of these different type of frigates are the exact same. Although for whatever odd reason, at the very bottom of the page there regarding the Rogue Traders, there's still a profile for 2 different ships there that are a lot more larger and bulkier versions of these alien type of frigates I just mentioned. For we have the Feral battleship here, that has lots of lances on it, including a prow lance of some kind. And is super accurate type of weaponry for its broadside, for it doesn't suffer penalties for shooting outside, 6,000 unit range, and even gets enhanced when targets are in close range there, as far as it treats all ships as closing, which means it assumes the targets are flying towards them there for the purposes of how many dice you get with your macro cannons. And there are very specific rules as to when you can use this battleship too, so for the life of me I could not tell you how this played out in Battlefleet Gothic, the tabletop version mind you, but even then there's still another ship called the Stirlix Caravan Vessel. For all intents and purposes, it's just another Space Hulk, but it has its own type of unique lance and macro battery weaponry. But it just looks like it just denies them the option of getting critical hits with their shots, although they make it sound like there's like a unique rule to it that allows affects the leadership of a opposing ship that is attacking, but it doesn't say anywhere in the special rules about it, mind you. So I'm at a loss for what the ship actually does with the Ghostlight weaponry. Now we're going to move on to Chaos here, and Chaos will have a couple new battle cruisers and regular cruisers, mind you, but interestingly enough they have included 4 different type of battleships, or rather 5 different type of battleships, and these are more like hero ships. Technically, you can kind of compare these to like the Nemesis ships of the Armada campaign. If you ever played through that, you basically had the option of fighting one of each of the Chaos Gods' Nemesis ships, as it were. So there was one of each type there, but interestingly enough, these ships are not the same ships that what we encountered in the campaign. The only exception would be the Terminus S, which is actually in here. And I think a lot of the reason for that is mainly because these had different weaponry loadouts, because hell, 2 of the ships mentioned in this page is the Vengeful Spirit and the Conqueror. And why these ships are really important? Well, the Vengeful Spirit was Horus's personal flagship, and the Conqueror was the World Eater's Angron's personal flagship, and both of these technically are Gloriana type battleships, which is kind of odd because these ships are on the profile we're looking at now for the Vengeful Spirit is basically no different than a regular battleship, so there was definitely some retweaking or retconning of the rules and lore regarding these ships, mind you. For the Vengeful Spirit is supposed to be a much bigger deal, and is currently the flagship of Abaddon the Despoiler, which is more than likely going to make an appearance in Armada 2. Hell, even these famous battle barges that it mentions here, most of these aren't even the Gloriana type battleships that were of all the Primarch legions in the Horus Heresy, mind you. The only one that's actually fits is the Alpha of the Alpha legions. All the other ones go by different names, so I don't know what to make of this, what we're seeing here in all honesty. But with that all said, the other 4 battleships there all were each of the individual Chaos Lords, or they each had the separate type of Chaos marks, mind you. So we had the Terminus S for Nurgle, which is the only one that at least got transferred over into the Armada campaign, whereas the other 3, and no, I take that back, the other 2 ships, the Wage of Sin and the Scion of Persperos, were basically the representation of Siege and Slaanesh, whereas the Khorne one, the Conqueror, as I already mentioned, is the Gloriana battleship, which also we have the stat line for. So for lack of a better term, this is all really messed up in my mind there. I don't know what to make of these, but there's still a lot of exciting stuff, if nothing else, for the campaign just regarding these battleships here. But for the actual heavy cruisers and regular cruisers, we have the Hekate heavy cruiser, which for all intents and purposes is just like another hybrid type of ship there. Think like a Devastation, but instead of lances on the broadside, they have them for the dorsal lances, and include a little bit of broadside macro cannons instead. While the Inferno class cruiser is just a regular cruiser class type of hybrid there, so both of these may not be very popular just because they're hybrid in nature, mind you, but there will be options nonetheless. Hell, they even include the option, just for the hell of it, of including a Chaos version of a Space Hulk that you can bring into the battle. And while the rules are the exact same of the Orc Space Hulk, where it's just very slow and very immobile, it had a lot more consistent and much more dangerous firepower as a result, so it's a lot more expensive as opposed to its Orc counterpart. And speaking of the orcs there, they had a couple of additional rules included to them there. For one, they had enhancements to the number of ships they can get there for free basically, as well as enhancements to their like leadership roles as well. So your frigate squadrons, if you can get them up to a large enough size, you would actually get bonuses to your leadership, since orcs in general are really bad at leadership, as made apparent by the fact that they're a lot more easier to insubordinate. But they also include a rule that if you have a certain amount of leadership, you basically get free escort ships added onto your squadrons, which allowed you to inflate the size of your frigate squadron at no cost, I guess. But the orcs do get a handful of additional upgrades available to them there, for we have the shock attack lance here, which for all intents and purposes is probably just like the shock attack gun in Armada 1, to a vague extent. You just didn't get the critical hit chance, or the actual critical hit effect rather, as opposed to shock attack lance, which just made your leadership roles a lot less effective. But they have claws on them there, which if you watch the video regarding the Tyranids, this works the exact same way. You get 2 attacks when you collide with another ship there, and if you were ever hit with both of them, pierced through the armor as it were, then you get to go for a ride with the ship there. And depending on the size of your ship, it would also heavily restrict its movement, if it could move at all. And never mind the fact that they also got something unique called a tractor field, which for all intents and purposes makes the ship equivalent to a battleship for the purposes of weight and size, I suppose. So this may be something that relates to ramming. It's really hard to say since I can't quite remember the rules of ramming off the top of my head, but it is another option that is available to them. Never mind the fact that they have an assault carrier, which isn't all that exciting. It just makes it so you can get a lot more boarding options, never mind boarding torpedoes. So it's a lot more centered around that. This is also where the Basha, or the light cruiser, was introduced to the orc fleet, in the Compendium no less. So it's a really cheap ship there with like options to get like smaller type of like guns and torpedoes on it there, as opposed to like its cruiser brethren. So it's just a smaller ship, as you would expect otherwise. The orcs also have a brand new type of frigate called the Grunt Assault Ship, with, for all intents and purposes, this thing is forced to equip the tractor field that we saw before, and makes it basically have kind of the same mass as a battleship. So this would be the prime example of it. It also had the upgrade options for claws and a lot of the other new stuff available to it. And alas, that was basically a rundown, at least arguably a quick rundown, of what the Compendium had to bring. Mind you, there's so much to the Compendium that it's really hard to find all the fine details, the nuances to it, aside for, of course, like I mentioned already, a lot of reclarification, rewording of a lot of the rules that are already in play. They also had the Tau Protector fleet there, which I already talked about in my Tau video, mind you, but that was from the Compendium that we're looking at now here. So there's a lot of other stuff I could probably go over. It would probably take an eternity to find everything, mind you, but these were the main things that came to light that stood out the most to me there. With the inclusion of the Inquisition and of course the rogue traders, there is possibility for a lot of new exciting stuff as far as DLC. Even though technically Tindalos did say they were not going to include DLC after the launch, but they also said that they were going to be including new campaigns for Chaos and ideally Eldar, which, if you ask me, depending who you ask, that would technically be DLC. It would be story DLC, mind you, but it would still be DLC, I would argue at least. But thank you for watching this series, everyone. For those of you who watched on through, this has been a bit of a growing experience for me here, for trying to do something drastically different, trying to get a little more used to this, because there's a lot of plans in stores. I'm incredibly excited for Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2, and I'm really hoping to bring up the content quite a significant amount for its release. For this series, if nothing else, has been to just mainly lay down the foundation for new kinds of content that I want to try and do for Armada 2's impending release. And it's still going to be some time before we get more news regarding that, but that is ultimately the dream that I had with this. And while I may argue it may not be the most impressive, but it is a stepping stone. It is the first step, and I'm hoping, if nothing else, to learn and improve from this. So thank you all again for watching. There will be more to come.